When I say Nebraska football and All-Americans, there's a number.
You are Locked On Huskers, your daily podcast on the Nebraska Cornhuskers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey, gang, DP here, Locked On Huskers. Thank you for making Locked On Huskers your first watch and listen each and every single day. And thank you for you everydayers who show up, post up, you put your comments down in the section. It's led to today's episode because several of you asked for me to talk about All-Americas at Nebraska, and there's categories over the course of the next few episodes. We're going to dance a little bit. But first, we need to thank the folks that make this happen, the folks at Birddogs. Rico, tell them about it.
Thanks, DP. Have you ever wondered what life would be like with only one pair of pants or shorts? Well, wonder no more, because Birddogs has the pants for you. They look great, feel great, will have you looking at yourself in the mirror like, damn! Their comfortable, versatile fabric allows you to wear these to work, on the golf course, or even on a hot date. Go to birddogs.com/lockedoncollege and enter the code LOCKEDONCollege with your order to get a free custom Birddogs Yeti-style tumbler, just like mine. Back to you, DP.
Thanks, Rico. Appreciate you and the folks from Birddogs for making this happen each and every single day. And this is what we're talking about. So we had some folks in the comments and actually folks who DM, and you're allowed to do both. So thank you. Whatever way you communicate, I'm certainly open with. But over the course of the next week, we're going to talk about All-Americas. And there's several different conversations you need to have when you're talking about All-Americas. But a lot of Nebraska's football legacy and blue blood status, and yes, I'm giving the blue blood status just from all the numbers that we've been able to accumulate over the course of these podcasts and letting folks know, listen, you can't talk college football without telling the story of Nebraska football, which is why they're a blue blood. By definition, if you can tell the story of college football without speaking about this program, then they're not a blue blood. Well, Nebraska was an era. It was an era, and you could talk about it in the legacy form. But then you have to get inside the numbers, and you need to deep dive a little bit, and I'm grateful that Nebraska football has a history that you can dive into and dissect and kind of consume in different ways. So the conversation, the topic was All-Americans, and we've been talking about Mount Rushmores and those things. In order to do that, you have to set the big grand picture. And the best of Nebraska football can be defined by All-American status. That it goes beyond Nebraska. It goes beyond the conference that they're playing in, whether Big 8 or Big 10. And it goes to the national level. And so when you have the numbers, and we'll delve into later episodes, later podcasts, comparing the number of Nebraska All-Americans to some of the other blue bloods so that we can actually look at them side by side and look at it. But in this episode, we're going to start with this. There are 110 consensus and or unanimous All-Americans. 110 total. 110 total. And you go up and down that list, and then you get into the consensus and the unanimous. And here's the difference, so we understand. And this is through the NCAA's own breakdown of consensus. A consensus All-American is a player who is listed as a first-team All-America by at least half of the recognized lists, All-America teams that are selected in college football annual. I'll say it again. A player who is listed as a first-team All-American by at least half of the recognized list selected annually in the collegiate sport. In this case, it is football, right? So then you have to say, okay, well then what's Nebraska's number? Well, if you have 110 All-Americans, that means people who have been identified as All-American by any of the annual football reports and teams and lists, selections, 110. And that puts you in the space of folks like Josh Bullock's 2002. We'll stay recent so we can have some point of reference. that Nebraska has not had an All-American since 2011. Zero All-Americans since 2011. The last All-American was Levante David at linebacker. Before that, Prince Amukamara, Alex Henry, and Ndamukong Suh. Those are in 2009 and 2010. Then there is another gap from 2009. Fast forward back to 2003, Josh Bullock, Kyle Larson. Then DeJuan Gross, Tony Finotti, Eric Crouch, and a name that I've never connected this name with Nebraska, Kyle Craver. In the year 2000, there was a defensive back by the name of Kyle Craver. And if I'm pronouncing it wrong, Kyle, my apology. Keyuo Craver. 2000, All-American defensive back for Nebraska. So a big part of Locked On Huskers for me is it challenges me to go back and learn history and to get more information along the way. Since the year 2000, and you can go back before Crouch, Finotti, and Craver, you have to go back to 2000 and Dominic Raiola, Carlos Polk, and Russ Hochstein. Now, that's it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, 10, 13 All-Americans in the 2000s. Shows a decline in the program, but that's neither here nor there. That's just why we're here talking about it the way we're talking about it. And then you get into, again, defining and redefining what these words mean and the placement of it. Almost half of those players were consensus All-Americans, which means that writers and coaches and fans and media people around the country, at least almost over half of those, 56 Huskers, are considered and accepted as consensus All-Americans, which means that they're in those great years that they had, they were exceptional enough that more than half the list named them, considered them, deemed them worthy of consensus All-America status. And we'll throw the break there, but I wanted to set the pin right there. Let's set the standard, because in the next 2 segments, we'll go over those 56 names, and then we'll set the stage for tomorrow's podcast, where we will talk about the elite group, and I won't even give you the number until the end of this podcast. Those numbers exist. They're real. There's a reason for them. And man, I will be smarter about Nebraska football after this is done. Hopefully you are too. Stay tuned. More Locked On Huskers coming right up. Hey gang, DP here again. You can check us out, Lick in America. We thank you for making Locked On your first watch and listen every day. Locked On Huskers, we greatly appreciate that. If you have not subscribed, hit the subscribe button. Get this content. You'll get the alerts sent to you each and every single day, so you get this content. It's a beautiful day. We want to get this content out, and again, setting the table for future discussions. When you talk about All-Americans, Nebraska football and All-Americans, you have to set the standard before you have the conversation. And the standard is, again, the being deemed All-America, and then the separation between the elite and the great, right? That 110 amazing All-Americans. But 56 of them, 56 Huskers. There it is. 5, 6. I can do that. I have to get my fingers right. 56 were deemed consensus All-American. And again, as the definition goes, a consensus All-American is a player who's listed as first-team All-American by at least half of the recognized list. All-America teams that are selected annually in football. So we have that thing set. Now, as we get through this, I said that there was the last All-American at Nebraska was linebacker Levante David in 2011. He also was the last consensus All-American. He was the last. And before that, then you get into, again, Prince Amukamara and Ndamukong Suh, Tony Finotti, Eric Crouch, Dominic Raiola. We're getting into that elite group and package of names. 1999 defensive back Ralph Brown was a consensus All-America. And with zero slight, but just to point the leverage between the elite level and the next level, that Mike Brown was also an All-American that year, but he was not a consensus All-American. Again, you make the face and you go, huh? What? Really? But that's a statement of truth. 1997 was an exceptional year. There were 3 consensus All-Americans on the 97 national championship team in Jason Peter, defensive tackle, Aaron Taylor, and Grant Wistrom. All consensus All-Americans. We should applaud that because that's not easy to do. It hasn't been done since 1997. 1996, another grand year. Imagine that. Aaron Taylor, Grant Wistrom, consensus All-Americans. 1995, Tommy Frazier was the lone consensus All-American. Tommy Frazier was Aaron Graham was an All-American. Jared Tomich was an All-American. But Tommy Frazier was the only consensus All-American in 1995. 1994, Brendan Stye, Ed Stewart, Zach Weger, all consensus All-Americans in 1994 for the Huskers. 1992, slackers, only 2 consensus All-Americans, Will Shields and Trev Alberts. Travis Hill, another Husker we do not talk about enough. Travis Hill played linebacker for the Huskers in 90 and was an All-American. I can tell you in 4 years, I've talked about Travis Hill twice. And we have to do better. Like a big part of this thing. 1990, 1991, what were y'all doing? Huskers, what was going on in 91 that there were no All-Americans? 1990, there was one lonely All-American. He was not consensus, but he was an All-American, Kenny Walker. 1989, Doug Glazer was an All-American. Jake Young was a consensus All-American. Again, another Husker that we don't talk about enough. A 2-time consensus All-American at center. And the reason why I said it is because in 1988, he was also a consensus All-America along with Broderick Thomas. 1987, this is stunning to me. There were no consensus All-Americans in 1987. Not Neil Smith, not Steve Taylor, not Broderick Thomas, not John McCormick at offensive guard. All All-Americans, none of them consensus. 86, Danny Noonan was in fact a consensus All-American. 85, no consensus All-Americans. 84, Mark Trainowitz at center. Again, another Husker that we don't talk about enough. This is part of why I want to do these lists, because it allows us to talk about some of the greats that get skipped and bypassed along the way. Go back to 1983. Yes, you had 2. Should have had 3, but actually you had 3 in 83. You should have had 4 because Turner Gill wasn't on the list. Steinkooler, Rozier, Fryer were on that list. In 82, Remington and Rozier. Jimmy Williams was not a consensus All-American. Voters, what were you thinking? Dave Remington was in 1981. In 1980, and I don't think the level of it is talked about, Jarvis Redwine was a consensus All-American. And help me, I hope I'm not saying his name, Randy Schleusner at offensive guard was a consensus All-American in 1980. Give this man his flowers. Junior Miller was a consensus All-American. Kelvin Clark in 1978. Vince Ferragamo was not a consensus All-American, but Dave Butterfield was as defensive back. Again, how are we not having the Dave Butterfield commercial? That's a great Husker name. How is that? How have we missed the boat on that? Again, we have to do better at that. There's one, man, 1975, Rick Bonas, who was a two-time consensus All-American. 1974, Marvin Crenshaw at offensive tackle. Again, another Husker name. And Huskers, go with me. If these are names that you talk about on a regular basis, when you talk about the greatest Husker football players ever, then hit me up and let me know a player that I knew of from his pro career with Baltimore Colts, because being a DMV kid, I got to see the Colts on a regular basis. John Dutton, a defensive tackle, was a consensus. And, of course, the Jet, Johnny Rodgers, along with Willie Harper, defensive end Willie Harper, Rich Glover, consensus All-America as well. They were all two-time. And then Larry Jacobson in 1971. Bob Newton on that 1970 team was a consensus All-American. We'll pause there because I want to roll through. Because I want to go back to the beginning of Husker football, and we'll roll up. We'll finish the final segment and roll through the elite names that were consensus All-Americans and set up tomorrow's podcast for unanimous All-Americans, which we'll talk about tomorrow. But more Locked On Huskers when we come back. Hey, gang, DP here, and thank you. I hope this has been a cool episode for you. It has for me, and just going through history and learning, again, some of the Husker greats that don't get often talked about as Husker greats. We tend to stay in the convenience of local recent players. But historically and truthfully, there are some great Husker players that have been talked about in this episode of Locked On Huskers that, quite frankly, I'll do better at being aware, because I think there's a deep dive, that stories that can be told of some of these great Huskers that we don't talk about nearly enough. We throw names around and we talk about the pipeline and we just rattle off a ton. And of course, in future episodes, we'll actually talk about those consensus All-Americans by positions. And I'll tell you, I got a little curious about it and dove down the well when we start looking at linebackers, defensive backs, and wide receivers. But those are conversations that will happen in future podcasts. Greatly appreciated. We're going to go back to 19. So you think about it this way, that Nebraska's first All-American ever takes us all the way back to, drum roll, what year, in your head, what year do you think the first All-American happened? 1994. Vic Halligan, offensive tackle. Vic Halligan, not a name that we've talked about much. Vic Halligan, according to the reports, was the first Nebraska All-American in 1914. And again, I need to do a whole deep dive in Vic Halligan. If he's the first, we have to talk about him as well. Guy Chamberlain in 1950 played in, who was a consensus, was Nebraska's first consensus All-American. Welcome to the big pool, Nebraska. Compliments of Guy Chamberlain. That's pretty cool. Ed Weir at tackle, 1994, was a consensus All-American. George Sauer, 1933, and all of the hearts of Nebraska shall grow one size larger by this next sentence. He was Nebraska's first consensus All-American fullback. Oh, we can get all emotional. George Sauer, 1933. And for a brief stretch, again, Nebraska started being fullback university, because in 1936, Sam Francis was also a consensus All-American at fullback. Well done, you two. Well done, well done. There were no other consensus players, All-Americans for Nebraska, until 1963. 1963, 1964, 1965, and 1966 was a wonderful run. Add 1967 to that. before they got to the first group of golden years in Nebraska football. But you had a stretch, and here are some of the names to recall. One of the great offensive linemen to ever play. As a matter of fact, they're both in that conversation. 1963, Bob Brown, an offensive tackle, was a consensus All-American along with Larry Kramer, tackle. Boy, that must have been some running game. That must have been some running game. Man, Freeman White. There's a consensus All-American. Why have we not talked about Freeman White? Walter Barnes, consensus All-American, tackle in 1965. This is a name I've never said. Laverne Allers, consensus All-American at guard for Nebraska in 1966. And then a name that we've talked about in previous podcasts, Wayne Malin, middle guard, consensus All-American 1966 and 1967. 56 Nebraska Huskers, consensus All-Americans. Out of 110, 56. And I'll ask you this before we shut this edition out. The difference between All-American, consensus, and unanimous. Stay tuned. Next episode. Unanimous Nebraska Husker All-Americans in football. I'm DP. Thank you for making Locked On Huskers your first watch and listen each and every single day. We'll close with those three words we love so much. Go Big Red.